Johnny Gosch was a 12-year-old paperboy in West Des Moines, Iowa, who disappeared in the early morning hours of September 5th, 1982, while he was on his paper route. In the years to come, his family would find out the shocking allegations of why Johnny was abducted in the first place, and also why so many children in this country go missing every year. Hi guys, welcome to Murder in the Midwest. I'm Brooke, and on my channel I do discuss unsolved homicides that occur in small Midwestern communities, as well as missing persons cases. Today we're going to be talking about the disappearance of Johnny Gosch, which is such a crazy story, and there's so many layers to it that we could honestly spend hours talking about it. But first, before we get into that, I do want to say if you like what you see, please hit that subscribe button. There's also a bell notification below. If you hit that, you will be notified of when I upload new videos. If you'd like to follow me on Instagram, I am Murder in the Midwest, and on Twitter, I am Murder Midwest. And I do want to say, before we get any further into Johnny's story, I am going to issue a warning that we will be talking about very sensitive subject matter that may not be suitable for everybody or may be triggering to some people. So we will be talking about pedophilia, we are going to be talking about child trafficking, as well as child pornography and molestation. So these are not fun topics to talk about, but I feel like it's so important to address the situation and what happened with Johnny and what continues to happen to hundreds, if not thousands of children in this country every single year. So first we're going to start with Johnny. So Johnny was a well-adjusted 12-year-old boy. He lived with his parents, Noreen and John Gosch Sr. in West Des Moines, Iowa. And he had been working for some time as a paperboy. He was delivering the West Des Moines Register Mail newspaper. He'd actually saved up enough money that he'd bought himself a new dirt bike, which he was really proud of. But one thing he wanted to do was to be able to go on his paper route by himself. Usually his dad went with him every single morning just as a safety precaution, but none of the other paperboys had their parents accompanying them, so he had been begging his parents to be able to go by himself. So they had decided the night before that on the morning of September 5th, Johnny would be allowed to deliver the papers on his own. So it started off as a usual morning. He got up around 5 a.m., got his little red wagon out that he always took with him to fill up the papers, and he also took the family's Dachshund, which was this little brown dog named Gretchen. So off he went, and he went to go, fill up his newspapers, saw some of the other paper boys as well, and started on his way. Now, about 6:30 a.m., the Gosches started to receive phone calls from their neighbors that they had not received their morning papers yet, which was really unusual. So obviously they were concerned. So John Gosch Sr. said, you know what, I'm going to go look for Johnny. So he took off, and pretty quickly, about 1-2 blocks from their house, he found Johnny's wagon, which was half filled with newspapers, as well as their dog Gretchen, but there's no signs of Johnny anywhere. So he started to talk to some of the other paper boys. Have you guys seen him? Do you have any idea what happened? And some of the paper boys said that they actually saw Johnny talking to a couple different men, but that was about it. So obviously the Gosches were concerned. They called the police right away. But back then, you couldn't file a missing persons report until somebody had been missing for at least 72 hours, even minors. Which, I can't even imagine how helpless they felt, because they're reaching out to help from the police, and the police actually suggested, do you think maybe Johnny ran away? Which was really an outlandish suggestion to them, because he had a great home life. There was absolutely nothing to suggest that Johnny would have wanted to run away. He didn't take anything extra with him, even if he did want to run away, so it made no sense. So instead of waiting those 72 hours, Noreen and John immediately jumped into action and started calling friends to organize a search party. So they start canvassing the area, start talking to people, and what they discovered was 2 eyewitnesses. They saw Johnny talking to 2 different men. They were driving this Ford Fairlane car that was a blue 2-toned vehicle, and it had Nebraska license plates. So one of the witnesses was named Mike, and he was a kid, but he was inside of his house. So he was just observing all of this through his bedroom window. Obviously, he couldn't hear the conversation, but he did absolutely notice that this car had Nebraska license plates, and he was able to give a description of the vehicle. The other eyewitness was an adult named John Rossi. He had actually been outside sitting on a bench, and he saw these men talking to Johnny. Now, again, he was far enough away that he wasn't able to hear the conversation either, but he said that he felt like something strange was going on. And again, he made note of the license plate. Unfortunately, neither Mike nor John Rossi could actually remember what the license plate numbers were. And I think that's something that really haunts John Rossi to this day. He even underwent hypnosis to try to remember the license plate vehicles, but all he could remember is that it was Nebraska license plates, and it was a Ford Fairlane blue two-toned vehicle. So of course, what the family is suspecting is that these men in this vehicle took Johnny and abducted him. Police, again, even after the Gosches were able to, enough hours had gone by for them to file a missing persons report, they weren't anything but helpful. And they kept suggesting over and over, are you sure that, Johnny didn't run away? There weren't any ransom notes left, which to me is sort of ridiculous because in most missing persons cases, there's not any ransom notes left. But they kept saying that we have no evidence that a crime has actually been committed. So of course the Gosches were infuriated, and they kept asking, why haven't you, brought the FBI in? We want the FBI involved. And the West Des Moines police were just very resistant to do anything. So the Gosches just plugged along. Noreen especially, she's a quiet, soft-spoken woman, but she's very determined, very intelligent, and she kept on it, and they kept searching for Johnny. But unfortunately, as the days and the weeks rolled by, they weren't finding any evidence of him. So the Gosches actually ended up, keeping this in the media, and this was a pretty famous case in the early 80s. So they made appearances on like the Today Show, Good Morning America, talking about this case, and even put out their home landline phone number for people to call if they had tips. So as you can imagine, they got all kinds of calls coming in, including crank calls and leads that they checked out but went nowhere. The Gosches actually even hired their own private investigators to look into this case since the police were so unhelpful. And what one of the detectives uncovered was something that I don't think the Gosches were expecting at all. So back in the 80s, the term, human trafficking or child trafficking, that wasn't even something that was talked about. It wasn't a phrase that had been coined yet. But what he uncovered was that a lot of these missing kids were being used to make, unfortunately, child pornography. And back in the 80s, of course, there wasn't the internet yet. So what they were doing is making brochures or books full of lewd pictures with these kids, or they were being used to film videos on videotape that would then go to the highest bidder. And obviously John and Noreen were terrified that possibly could be what happened to Johnny, but they had no evidence yet that he was connected to that. 6 months after Johnny went missing, there was an incident that happened in Oklahoma that gave the Gosches a lot of hope that Johnny was in fact still alive. There was a lady in the parking lot of a convenience store, and a boy started screaming, "I'm Johnny Gosch, I've been kidnapped." He was immediately whisked into a car by two men, and the car sped away. The lady didn't get any identifying factors of the car, unfortunately, but she alerted authorities, and she said that the boy, in fact, looked like the pictures of Johnny that had been in the media. So, again, this just kind of fueled the fire for the Gosches that he's out there. We have to keep chugging along. We have to find him. 2 years after Johnny disappeared, another boy in West Des Moines went missing as well. His name was Eugene Martin, and he was 13 years old. He was also a paperboy and went missing while delivering papers for the West Des Moines Register. A witness said he saw him talking to a man in a car, and Eugene Martin was never seen or heard from again. So obviously the Gosches and the Martins, both being in the Des Moines area, started talking, and they really felt like, okay, is there a link between these two cases? Are these the same men that could have taken Johnny? The police looked into it, but they said they could not determine a connection between the two. But the Martins and the Gosches always felt like this was perhaps the same people, and they felt like there was in fact a connection between the two. In September of 1984, a local dairy in the area came up with the idea of putting the images of Johnny and Eugene on the side of their milk cartons. So growing up in the 80s, this is something that I remember, they were called the milk carton kids. So when kids would go missing, they would put their pictures on the side of milk cartons. So Johnny and Eugene were two of the first to have that happen, in the hopes that it would bring more attention to their cases and somebody would see it and, have a tip that they could call in. Another piece of evidence came to light shortly after Johnny disappeared, which again gave the Gosches hope that Johnny was in fact still alive. A dollar bill surfaced that said, "I am alive," and it was signed Johnny Gosch. So this dollar bill was taken to authorities. It was shown to Johnny's parents, and they confirmed that they believed that was Johnny's handwriting and his signature. In 1984, something else happened that was very, very significant. So if you remember John Walsh, he used to host a show called America's Most Wanted, which was on for years and years in the 90s and early 2000s. He was very famous for having his son Adam abducted, who was later unfortunately found murdered. But he was a very notable public figure. He partnered with the Gosches, among others, and in 1984, they formed the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Noreen also felt like she needed to do something to change the current Iowa laws that required 72-hour waiting period before you could report somebody missing. And that's exactly what she did. So on July 1st, 1984, the Johnny Gosch bill was signed into Iowa law. This requires law enforcement to act immediately when a minor is reported missing. So no longer is there waiting time if somebody under the age of 18 goes missing. In 1986, another young boy goes missing in the Des Moines area. This time his name was Mark Allen, and he was 14 years old. He had been at his family's home. He was going to walk over to a neighbor's house and told his mom as he was walking out the front door, "Save some pizza for me. I'll be hungry when I get home." That is the last time his family would ever see or hear from Mark Allen ever again. So once more, the Gosches, the Martins, and the Allen family wondered, what's going on? Is Mark's disappearance connected to both Johnny and Eugene's? Once again, authorities said they couldn't find a connection between the three cases, but these families definitely believed that they could be connected. More years would go by before we would have a huge break in this case. And it's a huge break, but it's also one that's controversial because there are people that don't believe Paul Benassi, and there's people that absolutely think he's telling the truth. So in 1991, a man named Paul Benassi came forward. He was currently serving time in Nebraska prison for being a convicted sex offender. But he went to his lawyer, whose name was John DeCamp, and he said, "I have information about Johnny Gosch." So he told his lawyer, and his lawyer felt he was credible enough that he reported it to the authorities. Noreen actually went to the Nebraska prison and talked to Paul Benassi about what his involvement may have been with Johnny's disappearance. There is a fantastic documentary right now on Amazon called Who Took Johnny that came out in 2013, and they go deep into Johnny Gosch's disappearance. But one of the things that I think is remarkable is in this documentary, they actually have the video recording of Noreen meeting with Paul Benassi for the first time and him telling her all of this information that he knew about Johnny, which was not public knowledge. So this is what Paul Benassi said. Paul Benassi essentially said from the years about 1980 to 1988 that he had been used by a child pedophile ring, that they used kids to be sold to high up government officials, politicians, or just wealthy people that wanted to pay for these children. Once Paul got to be 18 and he aged out of this pedophile ring, they used him to help kidnap other children or lure other children into this pedophile ring. Paul said that he was actually one of the men that helped to kidnap Johnny Gosch. He said that he chloroformed Johnny and held him down in the back of that Ford Fairlane car. He said the mastermind of this pedophile ring was somebody named Emilio. And he did give a artist sketch to authorities. He never knew Emilio's last name or even if Emilio was his real name. Paul said that he was the first to molest Johnny on film. Paul was able to describe some discerning marks about Johnny. So Johnny Gosch had a very large birthmark on his chest. Now that was public knowledge, but he was also able to describe a scar that Johnny had on his tongue that was very visible, and it was from when Johnny was younger. He had fallen out of a treehouse and almost completely bit through his tongue. That had never been public knowledge. He also described a burn scar that Johnny had on his lower leg. And he also was able to describe a stammer that Johnny would get when he would get upset. He also said that Johnny talked a lot about going to yoga with Noreen and talking about like he would meditate and try to kind of go to another place while all this was happening with him. And Noreen was astounded because she, in fact, was a yoga enthusiast. She had taken Johnny with her to yoga. It's not something she had ever talked about in any of her interviews because she's like, why would I? That wasn't relevant information. Johnny, in fact, did have a stammer. Again, never talked about that. He had the scar on his tongue. He had the burn mark on his lower leg. Those had never been made public knowledge. So after she talked to Paul Benassi, she absolutely believed that he had been in contact with Johnny. Now they took this information to the West Des Moines police, but they quickly discredited Paul Benassi. Not only was he a convicted sex offender himself, but he had been diagnosed with multiple personality disorders. And I've heard upwards of 14 distinct and different personalities he had. Now, the reason he was diagnosed with multiple personality disorder is because he himself had suffered such vile sexual abuse as a child that it had caused him to split off and make these different multiple personalities. I still think that made him a credible witness, especially with the details that he had about Johnny, but West Des Moines police refused to talk to him. They also said that because Paul was located in Omaha, Nebraska at the time, there's no way that he could have been in West Des Moines. However, Omaha and West Des Moines are only 2 hours apart. So yeah, he very obviously could have been there, kidnapped Johnny, and driven back to Omaha. Police eventually, like years later, talked to Paul's siblings, and Paul's siblings said no, he was in Omaha at the time that Johnny was kidnapped. There's no way he could have done that. But again, it's only a 2-hour drive, and if Johnny was taken in the early morning hours, he could have been back in Omaha by 9 a.m. that day. And remember, both eyewitnesses said that the car that was seen talking to Johnny had Nebraska license plates. So I do feel like Paul is a credible witness, and I wish that authorities had explored that more. So here's where things get a little sticky. In November of 1988, authorities raided a credit union in Omaha, Nebraska. It was called the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union. A man named Lawrence E. King Jr. was arrested for embezzlement. Lawrence had been the credit union manager, and he was being accused of embezzling up to $40 million from the credit union. Now, why am I bringing this up? What does this have to do with Johnny? Well, what happened after Lawrence was arrested is that all these people started to come forward and say, you know what, Lawrence wasn't only embezzling money from this credit union, he was actually the head of a child prostitution ring. And some of the allegations against him were incredible. Alleged abuse victims were interviewed, one of them being Paul Benassi, who claimed that children in foster care from nearby Boys Town, which is in Nebraska, they were being flown to the east coast of the United States to be sexually abused at various parties. Multiple abuse allegations came forward, as well as others who said that they saw King molesting children. One man came forward and said he physically saw Lawrence E. King raping a 10-year-old boy. Another person came forward who was a photographer who said he was hired by Lawrence King, and what he would do is pay him to basically burst in on these politicians and higher up people while they were in bed with these young children and take pictures, and Lawrence would then use those as blackmail. So many people came forward with allegations, including Paul Benassi. He said that from 1980 to about 1988 that he was used by Lawrence King. He was, not only raped and molested by him, but he Lawrence used Paul to procure other children for this child prostitution ring. So these were horrendous allegations. So much so that a grand jury was formed just to look into the child prostitution ring allegations. So for 2 years, this grand jury looked at the different evidence that was presented, and then in 1990, they said, nope, there's not enough credible allegations against Lawrence King. He was ultimately convicted of embezzlement of $40 million, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison, of which he served 10. Now, Paul Benassi and another eyewitness that came forward were actually indicted with perjury. Paul has never wavered in his claims, though, that this happened to him. And he is actually heavily featured on this documentary as well, Who Took Johnny? And he's featured throughout the years from when he first talks to Noreen up to 2013. And I mean, his story is spot on, exact every single time. So he very much stands by his story that yes, he was taken by Lawrence King. He was used to procure other children. This absolutely happened. So those were shocking allegations, and we could do a whole other episode on the Franklin scandal as it came to be known. There's been books written about it, one of whom was written by Paul Benassi's lawyer, John DeCamp. He wrote a book called The Franklin Cover-Up, and there's another book called The Franklin Scandal that was written by a journalist and author as well. In 1992, America's Most Wanted actually aired an episode about Johnny Gosch, and they interviewed Paul Benassi for this episode. Now, one of the producers that worked on this episode actually talked to the documentary Who Took Johnny, and I think at first he even felt like, is Paul telling the truth? Is he not? But again, he felt like Paul was very credible, and once again, his story never wavered. The things that he talked about seemed crazy because, again, at that time, nobody talked about human trafficking or pedophile rings or child prostitution. It's just not something that we as a society had really addressed yet. After they aired that initial episode about Johnny Gosch, America's Most Wanted said they were flooded with phone calls from children who said, yep, we knew Paul, we were part of this child prostitution ring as well. In the initial episode that aired, Paul had talked about how some of the kids were branded with this very specific symbol, which again, I think the producer thought maybe that was a little outlandish. But then kids came forward that had that symbol on them. They did a follow-up episode in which one of the children spoke anonymously, so he was like shadowed out and they changed his voice, but he showed the brand that he had on his arm that was the exact symbol that Paul had described. He talked about his time in this child prostitution ring and what all it entailed. Paul also said that there was a house in Colorado where a lot of these children were taken. So the producers were like, okay, take us to this house, show us where it is. Again, I think they were a little skeptical that Paul would be able to produce this house, but he sure did. So again, in the documentary, they show Paul taking them to this house. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere in Colorado. And he had told them that underneath the house, there was like this gate underneath the house, and there's a part of the gate that you can remove, and the house is dug out, and that's where they would keep the children. Sure enough, they pull up to this house, which was abandoned. He goes right up to that part of the gate that he said would move. He takes it off, and sure enough, they go underneath the house, and it's all completely dug out. And then on all the banisters or posts that are holding up the house, there's names of kids carved in there and initials of children carved in there. They tried to track down who owned that house. They discovered it was owned at that time by a prison guard, but they tried to find this prison guard and they said he completely disappeared off the face of the earth. So just another one of those things that I think was frustrating to them, because the producer said, you know, if we at America's Most Wanted, with all of our money and all of our resources, kept coming up with dead end after dead end, how is anybody supposed to find these people? Paul had also talked about in his episode for America's Most Wanted that there was a man named the Colonel that was kind of like also high ranking in this pedophile ring and kind of pulling the strings and making sure that children were going to the highest bidder. And again, people came forward after that episode and said, yep, we know who the Colonel is. Nobody knew his real name. And that's what made this so hard, because you know, everybody had a nickname, or we only knew their first names. And even though they were able to come up with composite sketches of who these supposed leaders of this pedophile ring were, they were never able to track them down. So, you know, we get a little bit of a lead and some clues, but then it ends in frustration, because that's the farthest that it went. Paul Benassi also said that one reason that a kid like Johnny would be taken is because they really took two types of children. So one were the throwaway kids and the other were the clean kids. So the throwaway kids were kids, runaways off the street, maybe already had some drug problems, what have you. Maybe they'd already been previously molested or raped. The clean kids is the category that Johnny would fall into. So they were the virgins. They were the ones that would warrant a lot of money because they hadn't been touched yet, which is so disgusting when you think about it, but that's how they would categorize them. Paul also said that this network of human traffickers was all based out of Omaha. So the Colorado, location, it all operated out of Omaha, Nebraska. In 1993, a British production company was actually commissioned by the Discovery Channel to dive into all of these allegations about the Franklin Credit Union and all the child prostitution scandals. So this British production company comes over to the United States. They start to dig in and they start to do interviews about it. And as soon as they kind of get into the fact that this was involving high-level politicians and government officials and that sort of thing, next thing you know, they were shut down. They're like, yep, we're not going to do the documentary. So Discovery Channel pulled the plug out of nowhere, never really gave the production company a reason why they were pulling the plug, and it was done. So they filmed a little bit of footage, but really that was it. So very interesting to think, were they threatened by somebody? Were they paid off by somebody to pull the plug on this documentary? I guess we'll never know. So in 1999, at this time, Paul Benassi has gotten out of prison, and he actually filed a civil lawsuit against Lawrence King Jr., accusing him of repeated sexual assaults, false imprisonment, and forcing Paul to scavenge for other children. The judge actually ruled in Paul's favor, and he said that the uncontradicted evidence is that the plaintiff has suffered much, all in connection with the multiple personality disorder caused by the wrongful activities of the defendant. A fair judgment to compensate the plaintiff is necessary, and Paul was awarded a $1 million compensation, of which he was never paid. But I guess you could say it was a victory on paper, if not monetarily. During Paul Benassi's civil suit in 1999, Noreen was called as one of the witnesses. And while she was on the stand, she was asked by one of the lawyers if she had ever had any contact with Johnny since he went missing. Now, I'm sure everybody in the courtroom expected her to say, no, I haven't seen or heard from him since he went missing. But she actually hesitated to answer. The attorney told her, you have to answer or you will be in contempt of court. And she answered, yes, I have seen him. 2 years ago, he came to my house and he told me exactly what happened to him. As you can imagine, this caused shockwaves. I think to the point where Noreen even said, you know what, I wish I would have just been in contempt of court and not answered. Because she said by the time she got home that day, headlines were already splashed everywhere that she had seen Johnny. So this is a major point of contention. Like, did she really see Johnny? Did he come to the house or did he not? I would say it's split really 50-50. Some people absolutely believe her. Why would she have made this up? Others either think she's lying or don't know. Noreen and John Gosch Sr. had gotten divorced in 1993, so he wasn't at the house when Johnny came by. But this is what Noreen said happened. In March of 1997, Noreen said that she was fast asleep and she heard somebody knocking on her front door. It was around 2:30, 3 a.m. in the morning. She got up, looked out the peephole, and she saw two men standing out there. She said, "Who is it?" And the young man in front said, "It's me, Mom, it's Johnny." She immediately opened up the door. Now keep in mind, at this point, Johnny would have been 27 years old, and the last time Noreen saw him was when he was 12. But she said she could still recognize him, and he opened up his shirt to reveal his very distinct and large birthmark that he had on his chest. So Noreen invited him in. She said the second man with Johnny never spoke. He never introduced himself. Johnny never said who he was. He just sat there while Johnny and Noreen spoke. She said Johnny stayed for about an hour to an hour and a half, and then he left. But while he was there, this is what she said. She said the night he came here, he was wearing jeans and a shirt and had a coat on because it was March and it was cold. His hair was long, it was shoulder length, and it was straight and dyed black. After the visit, she did have the FBI create a composite sketch of what she said Johnny looked like then. She said that Johnny had basically validated what Paul Benassi had said, that he had been kidnapped, that he had been used in this child prostitution ring. He didn't go into explicit details, and she thinks that's probably because he didn't want to upset her by telling her graphically what had happened to him, and or he may have been embarrassed by it. He did not reveal where he was living. He said he was going under an alleged name because he was fearful of the people that ran this ring. So once he got to be older, I'm guessing around 18 years of age, they supposedly kicked him out of the ring, but he was still very fearful. They had made threats against him: if you ever tell anybody who we are or what we did, we will kill you, we will kill your family. So he was very, close-lipped about where he was living now, how he was getting by, type of thing. When he left, he hugged Noreen. He asked her not to tell anybody that he had been there, and she said that she wouldn't, and that was it. So that occurred in 1997. Obviously, that didn't come out till 1999. Again, I choose to believe Noreen that this visit did occur. One, because truth is always stranger than fiction. Why in the world would she make something like this up? And if she was making something like this up, why wouldn't she say that he came and visited her immediately? Why would she say it was 2 years ago? She also only released this information when she was under oath in a court. It's not like she went to a newspaper on her own or came out and said that this happened. She didn't even tell Johnny's father that this happened. Like, she literally told no one. So, it makes me believe that this did happen and that this did occur. And unfortunately, I don't know if Noreen ever heard from him again. I have a feeling that if she did, she's probably not gonna say. In 2000, Noreen wrote and self-published a book called Why Johnny Can't Come Home. And in it, she details her understanding of what Johnny went through. And, part of it is based on the night of the visit and what he told her, as well as other information that she had found up until that point. I will link the Amazon link where you can buy it below. It is a little pricey. When I looked at it, it was $70, probably because I'm sure there's not a lot of prints left of it, and I'm sure it's hard to find. But if I could get my hands on a less expensive copy, I would love to read it. So everything was a little quiet on the Gosch home front until about 2006. So Noreen alleges that basically an envelope landed on her front step, and in it there were photographs of boys that were bound and gagged. And she thinks that one of those boys is Johnny. This is the only time where I'm like, I don't really see it. I mean, it is a blonde young boy that would have been around Johnny's age, but to me, it doesn't really look like the pictures of Johnny that I've seen from when he was around 12, 13 years old. But Noreen is very adamant that she believes it was Johnny. So she immediately took these pictures to the authorities, and it was talked about in the news. However, somebody wrote an anonymous letter to the police station saying essentially, somebody has played a horrible prank on Noreen. These are not photos of boys that have been kidnapped. These were photos of boys that were taken in Tampa, Florida around 1979 to 1980, so well before Johnny was abducted, and they were challenging each other to an escape contest. There was actually an investigation concerning those pictures that was looked into by the Hillsborough County, Florida Sheriff's Office, and no files were charged because no wrongdoing was established. The lead detective on the case, his name was Zalva. You should be able to check this out. So obviously the authorities did contact this Zalva, and he said, yep, I do remember when these photos came out. I checked into it. The family said exactly that the boys were challenging each other to an escape contest. There wasn't anything illegal or nefarious going on. He said that he identified all the members of the photos, but 3 boys in the photo pictures were identified by law enforcement, but not the one thought to be Johnny. So Noreen still believes that that was a photo of Johnny being tied up and held captive. So I don't know. Either it was these boys that were just doing something silly back in the late 70s, early 80s, or it could have been a picture of Johnny. Again, I don't really see it, but I'll put up the pictures and you can decide and let me know what you think. So that's really been the last big update in this case. So where is everybody at now? Well, Noreen did remarry and she continues to do work. She talks to schools about, what to look for, the signs to look for if you're out and you see that you suspect that maybe somebody is being trafficked, what to do in those instances, how to keep your kids safe. She also talks to other families that have had kids go missing and sort of serves as a counselor to them, and also gives them advice. This is what we did, these are the steps that we took. So she's very passionate about making sure that other families are heard and are supported when their children go missing. Paul Benassi, according to the documentary that came out in 2013, had been married for 10 years and actually started a family. In the documentary, his later interviews in 2013, he actually looked and he looked like he had maybe been to therapy and was on some medication. So hopefully he's been able to put his demons in the past. John Lawrence King Jr., the one that was, supposedly the head of this child prostitution ring. The last thing I could find about him was that after he got out of prison, which would have been in the late 90s, supposedly he moved to Washington, D.C., but I can't find anything about him since then. So I don't know if he's still alive. I don't know what he's doing for a living. I don't know. As hard of a subject matter as this is to talk about, I do think it's important. I recently saw a statistic that the United Nations didn't even have human trafficking as a crime until the year 2000. And it's astonishing to me that really only in the last 20 years have we as a country become aware that this is a thing and that this happens on a regular basis. I think some of those accusations back in the 80s were just so almost outlandish to people because they had never heard of such a thing. I mean, like I said earlier, Noreen had never even heard the word pedophile before. She didn't know what that meant. And this is a grown woman, but it just wasn't talked about in the media the way it is now. And I think recently with things like the Jeffrey Epstein case, we absolutely know that underage boys and girls are trafficked all over the country, all over the world. And even recently, I've been seeing more and more headlines. I don't know if I'm just more aware of it, but I've seen recently headlines where, authorities are finding upwards of 30, 40 people in a house that have been trafficked. So I think it is important for us just to educate ourselves. Like if you see somebody out in public, what are the signs to look for that you think this might be happening to a young kid? What should you do if you see somebody that you think is in this situation? So I will link a website below that kind of walks through that. I think it's just really important to educate ourselves as a society on what to look for and what to do if we are faced with those circumstances. And as far as Johnny goes, we obviously don't know what happened to him. I know I would like to think that he is still in communication with Noreen, that she just keeps that on the down low, and hopefully he's living his best life. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.